talk about the story of Deborah and Jael, part of which we just heard. The reason for doing that is to think about what happens with women in the life of the church. Not that women necessarily in the life of the church get treated any differently than they might do in medicine or academia or engineering or anything like that. But we just read another scripture reading that said the church is supposed to be the city on the hill, the light that cannot be hidden. We are supposed to be the shining example, trying to point the way to how things really ought to be. And I put it to you that actually we're not doing a particularly splendid job of that. If you were here last week, I started this series talking about Eve, the life giver, and we talked about that for a little while. And then the next day, Monday, an essay was published by a fellow who is a pastor of a very, very large church and also the dean of a seminary, in which he argued that not only should women not be pastors of churches, but that women should not be employed as faculty members at seminaries. Because obviously if only men can be pastors, women cannot model that for men, so they simply shouldn't be part of education at all at the seminary level. That was his argument, and this is a person whose voice is a very loud one in the United States. So I know that we don't think like that, and we don't talk like that, but we have this little bubble going on here. And for women going into ministry and working in the life of the church, what goes on out there is not the same as what goes on in here. So that's a problem. So thinking about that is important. The inspiration for me for this came from this book called Bible Women, All Their Words and Why They Matter. And this is the book. I'm not going to run through all the statistics, but the author of that book takes this Bible, the New Oxford Annotated Bible, and imagine you tear out all of the junk stuff, the maps and the footnotes, and throw all of those away. And then you count the words in the New Testament, the Apocrypha, and the Old Testament. You would wind up with about 1.1 million words in this book. It's big. I showed you one last week, the big book here. Of that 1.1 million words, only 14,000 of those words are on the lips of women, which is just over 1%, which is why I called the series the 1%. That's how much women get to speak in the narrative. Now you might say, well, of the other 99% of the words, not all of those are on the lips of men. And in a sense that's true, because there is, of course, descriptive narrative that's not on anybody's lips. But who wrote it, all this stuff? It was men. So really, the other 99% really is the voices of men, and that's the point that is made in that book that I showed you. So in the biblical narrative, there are 93 women who speak. 51 are in the Old Testament, 20 in the New Testament, 7 in the apocryphal books that most Protestants have never heard, because Protestants don't treat the apocryphal books as canon, as rule of faith. The Catholic Church does, and the Orthodox with a capital O Church does. So people who grew up in a Catholic church are quite used to hearing readings from Judith, Tobit, First Maccabees, things like that. But most Protestants are not. They probably may have never heard of these books, which is a shame, because out of those books in the Apocrypha, the apocryphal book of Judith, on the lips of Judith in that book, you get 2,600 of the 14,000 are hers. And most Protestants have never heard that voice at all. So the 10 women who speak the most in the Bible are all in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha. Many of them are scarcely known to us, and most of the women who are well known to us actually say very little. And we looked at some examples of that. Today, I want to just focus in on the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, there are 8 women who speak. Achsah, I'm sure you're all fully familiar with Achsah, which is to say, of course. So, I confess, I went and looked, I thought, who? And went and looked up, because it's just there for a little snippet. Deborah and Jael, who we want to talk about, and then these other characters. So only 8 women speak in the book of Judges. They speak a total of 526 words in the entire book of Judges, these 8 women, so 526 between 8 of them. And the 2 women I'd like to talk about tonight, Deborah speaks 114 words, and Jael speaks 23. Now, as I mentioned last time, most people speak at about 120 words a minute, and so Deborah gets just less than a minute, and Jael gets a few seconds of speech. Now, the number of words spoken by Deborah, saying 114, actually is a little bit of an artifact of the way that the author in that book about words of women counts words. Because the way she counts words is that if a woman speaks at the same time as one or more men, she doesn't count it as being on the lips of a woman, because in that culture at that time, everybody would have been listening to the men, even though the woman was standing with them. So she doesn't count Judith chapter 5, which is, Judges chapter 5, which is famously called the Song of Deborah, because the Song of Deborah isn't just spoken by Deborah, it's spoken by Deborah and Barak. That's her method, and I looked at it and I thought, I could fix that, but then I realized, of course, I don't really have any right to tell one woman how to count the words of another woman, so I should just shut up about that and let it go. The Song of Deborah is very interesting. It's one of the oldest pieces of writing in the entire biblical narrative. It may be the oldest poem that exists in the Bible. But to understand how the book of Judges works, does two things. First of all, you have to know in sort of the timeline of the history of the people of Israel, where does it fall? So here's the story. The people are in slavery in Egypt. Moses leads them out through the desert, gets them to the edge of the promised land and dies. And then Joshua leads them into Canaan across the River Jordan. And we have what's often called the Conquest of Canaan. The description in the book of Joshua is an exceptionally bloodthirsty description of events that happen. First thing that happens is that the city of Jericho is completely annihilated, and then the city of Ai completely annihilated. Most modern day biblical scholars don't really think that the people went in and there was one massive war. They think that there were battles interspersed with assimilation and settling and farming and things like this. So that happens, and then the people settle into the promised land. And then later in time, they decide they want to get themselves a king, and you wind up with a monarchy. But in between those two events, there's a period where it's not really clear who's in charge. And what you have is lots of tribes living, and they're just doing their own thing. And when trouble comes along, somebody rises up to unite two or three of the tribes and do something, usually something military. And that's called the period of the Judges. And in the book of Judges, the way the story works is, I think everybody who reads the book of Judges would see this. Here's how it works. There's a group of people like us, and everything is well and life is good. And when everything is well and life is good, people fall away from God because they think they don't need God because everything's good. And so they fall away, and they fall away into apostasy, so ignoring God or talking badly about God because they're fine. And then what happens is when people fall away into apostasy, things start going wrong. Of course, at this time, whenever anything went wrong, everybody naturally assumed that God did it because they saw the hand of God in everything. So they fall into apostasy, then everything goes wrong, and when everything goes wrong, a leader arises who guides the people out of trouble. And when the people get out of trouble, then everything is well again. And when everything is well, what do people do? They fall away from God into apostasy, and round you go again and again and again. And the book of Judges describes 12 such cycles, 12 judges. Some of them are described with just 2 or 3 sentences, and others with great big long narratives, but there's 12 of them in the book of Judges. There are also judges mentioned in 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1 Samuel, and technically I suppose you ought to include Moses from earlier in the story because he acts as a judge as well. So there's a bunch of judges, but 12 of them are in the book of Judges, and that's where we're going to look. So here's what happens in our story. So everything's good with the people. Life is okay. So what do people do? They fall away into apostasy. And the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They fell away. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan. So trouble came in the form of the Canaanites, which of course they naturally attributed to God, punishing them. And the commander of that army was Sisera. So the Israelites cry out to God for help. Sisera has, we're told, 900 chariots of iron. And he'd been oppressing the people for a little while when this happens. So 900 chariots of iron. This is a little reminder to us that this story is set at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. That's how old these stories are. These are really ancient stories. So the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. This guy has his hands on iron from somewhere. Most people don't. And if you have an army and you've got iron, you can make spears and swords and chariots and things. And the other guys are trying to make them out of wood and things like that. So you have a tremendous advantage if you can get your hands on iron. And Sisera has 900 chariots of iron. That's an expression that means has an incredible military advantage over the people. And at that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. That's the expression that's used for one of these leaders that rises up. They are said to judge Israel. They're not usually described as a judge. They are someone who judges Israel. So what we know about Deborah is she's married. She's a prophetess, which means she speaks prophetically about what's happening in the world. She'll be able to look at what's going on in the world and say to us, if you keep doing this, all sorts of trouble is going to happen. And then we ignore her and we do it anyway, and then all sorts of trouble happens. That's kind of how they looked at it. And she was judging Israel. Now, we're told in the story that she used to sit under the palm of Deborah, so sat under a tree, and people would bring their problems to her. Israelites came up to her for judgment about things. Now, we're told that she's between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. So this map that's over here is a rough attempt where people try to show where the different tribes of Israel were living at this time. How accurate it is, we don't really know. But this big pink blob here is Ephraim, and Bethel is right there on the border with the area where the tribe of Benjamin lives. Ramah is so close to Bethel that on that scale they would be on top of each other on this map, so they're right next to each other. But interestingly, when we see this, I would like you to also notice that way up here in the north, there's this orangey, greeny bit called Naphtali. That's where the tribe of Naphtali lives. And right there is where the tribe of Zebulun lives. And that matters because in the face of this trouble with the Canaanites, she sends and summons Barak from Kadesh in Naphtali, that place up in the north that I just showed you, and says to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. So those two places up in the north. He's going to bring soldiers from there. And then she says, I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon. So, a wadi is like a river that is full of water at some times of the year and dry at other times of the year. We have them in Texas and places, right? So by a wadi with his chariots and his troops. And then she says, I will give him into your hand. So what do we see from this? First of all, Deborah speaks for the Lord, the God of Israel. She does in that passage. She speaks for the Lord. And Deborah, speaking for God, commands Barak, who is a military leader and a man, and she tells him what to do. She is a leader. And Deborah, speaking from God, doesn't just order one man around. She orders the assembly of an army of 10,000 men, and is clearly the person who is giving the orders here. And Deborah says that she will draw out Sisera with his chariots and his troops and give them over into Barak's hands, her military leader. She's going to do it. Well, Barak's reaction to this, I've always loved this. Barak says, if you'll go with me, I'll go. But if you're not going with me, I'm not going. No, no, no. I'm not going without you, he says to the woman. I'm not going on my own, the big military leader with his 10,000 men. I want you to come with me. So he refuses to confront the enemy without Deborah going with him. And Deborah says, sure, I'll go with you. But nevertheless, the road on which you're going will not lead to your glory. You're not going to get the glory from all of this, because the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So We have the guy with his 10,000 troops. We have one woman, and she makes reference to into the hand of a woman. Maybe that's a different woman. So maybe 2 women, 10,001 men here. Let's just see who makes the most difference. What happens next in the story, without going through all the details, is Deborah and Barak assemble their 10,000 troops from up north, from Zebulun and Naphtali. Sisera assembles his 900 chariots of iron and all the troops who are with him. And one morning they decide they're going to get into it. So, Deborah says to Barak, "Get up, up." This is an imperative. It's an order. So she orders him to get up and get about his business, and she says, "This is the day." Usually we say, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." This is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you. So she commands Barak what to do. Get up. She predicts victory over Sisera, and she says, "The Lord is indeed going out before you." She invokes the presence of the Lord among the people. She does, the woman. And here's what happens. Barak goes with his 10,000 warriors, and the Lord, so they see the hand of God in everything, remember, the Lord throws Sisera with all of his chariots and his soldiers into a real tizzy. That's the technical term. It says into a panic before, so they get all panicked here. So what does Sisera do, this great military leader? He sneaks off. He jumps out of his chariot and he runs. He deserts everyone. He runs off. He fled on foot. So Barak, with his troops, now has a choice. He can either chase this one guy, Sisera, who's the leader, or he can fight against all of the men on the iron chariots, and he decides to do the latter and fight against all the soldiers on the chariots. He does that. He pursues the chariots and the army, and all the army of Sisera falls by the sword. No one is left. So they are absolutely annihilated. The only person who's left in this story is Sisera, who's supposed to be the leader, and he snuck off and abandoned his people. So what happens now is that Sisera, he's really got nowhere to go, decides he's going to try and find a place where there's a neighboring clan. Remember on the map how everything's divided by tribes, and each tribe's got little clans in it. And so he goes looking for a clan that's relatively friendly to the Canaanites, hoping they'll take him in. And we're told Sisera flees away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. We don't know very much about the Kenites, but we're told there's peace between King Jabin of Hazor, he's the king of the Canaanites, and the clan of the Kenites. So there's some sort of peaceable arrangement between them. He flees off, and we're told he goes to the tent. Now it's interesting how this is described, because usually in a sort of clan arrangement, what you'd have is there'd be a man and wife. So that would be Jael and Heber and their children and maybe their grandchildren, and their children of married people, and everybody has servants and slaves and people like that, and flocks and herds, and so it's a big operation, and they might all settle together and live together in some sort of clan-like arrangement. And somewhere in there, Jael, the wife of Heber, has a tent. And we are told that Jael comes out to meet Sisera and says to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Now, quite what's going on here has a little bit baffled people for some years. First of all, when somebody shows up to visit your clan, the rules of ancient Near Eastern hospitality are in play, and you have to offer hospitality to the person who shows up. It's a rule. To them, hospitality is more important than almost anything else. So there's a possibility she's just extending normal hospitality. But we're told he goes inside of her tent. That's a little weird. And not only does he go inside of her tent, but we're told she covered him with a rug. Now that means something. And just as we have in modern day English sort of sexual innuendo that people use, where you say something and you mean something quite different. like, you might say, those two people are sleeping with each other. Well, if they were just sleeping, you wouldn't care, right? That's not what you mean at all. You mean something entirely different. It's got nothing to do with sleeping. And the expression covered him with a rug is one of those expressions in Hebrew that's got there's some sort of sexual thing going on here. And we're told that he says to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty. And then she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him, which is another one of those expressions. The skin of milk thing, remember these folks, they didn't just drink milk, they fermented milk into alcoholic. I don't know if you've ever tasted fermented milk, but all I can tell you is it must be an acquired taste, because I tried it once, it's just horrible. But I didn't grow up drinking it. So, and then he says to her, stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you, is anyone there, say no. So he tells her to go stand there and lie. One understanding of what's going on here is that she is seducing him. Another understanding is that it's possible he's forcing himself on her. You know, he went into her tent. Things like that. It's like, whoa, that's not supposed to happen here. But it's a little obscure, quite what's happening. So several possible things, from normal hospitality to forcing himself on her, to her seducing him, to maybe her being upset because she's being ordered around and told to lie, which is a really bad thing if you're in a clan and you're trying to maintain friendly relations with other clans. You don't want to be caught misleading people. So quite what's going on is a little obscure, but what happens next is not obscure. What happens next is Jael takes a tent peg and a hammer and creeps in, and he's asleep, and she takes the tent peg and puts it against his temple, and with the hammer she whacks it right through his head and pins his head to the ground, and she kills him. So this woman who has a total of, you remember how many words she gets in the entire story? 23, right? 23 words in the whole story. But nonetheless, this woman has agency. She doesn't let her lack of words does not silence her. She does this. And while it might seem incredibly violent and aggressive and horrible to us, she brings about a period of peace for the people of Israel that had not been known for a long time. So what happens now is, remember, Barak has been off and he's gone and annihilated all of the enemy troops. The only job left for him is to go find Sisera, the leader who ran off and abandoned his troops. So Barak is looking for Sisera and comes across Jael. She comes out to meet him and says, oh, so you're the guy who's got 10,000 troops and you're chasing one guy, right? Yeah. Come with me for a minute. And she comes in and shows him, there he is, with a tent peg driven through his head, pinning his head to the floor. He's dead there. I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So what we discover is, at the end of the next chapter, we see the consequence of the actions that Deborah has brought into play and that Jael has acted out, is that the land had rest for 40 years. She brought about a period of peace here now because she's killed the Canaanite general. They've annihilated the Canaanite army. There is now peace and calm among the people. It might not be our way of getting peace and calm, but these two women, they changed everything. They changed history here in this story. So now, whenever I read this story, I always think, I jump ahead in my mind to the story of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who in the Magnificat, when she's saying her great prayer, great song, she says, God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones. And I always think back to this story where these two women, they certainly brought down the powerful in their story. In the story of Deborah, two women bring down the powerful from their thrones. They certainly do. And what Mary says in the Magnificat, and speaking as a young woman, she talks about how God has blessed her and how that surely for all generations this will sort of roll forward through history, this blessing placed for women. to be able to accomplish things like this, bring down the powerful from their thrones. That's what that's about here. So how about the voices of women today? How do their stories show God working through them to bring down the powerful from their thrones, which is what young Mary prays about and what Deborah and Jael actually succeeded in doing. So I put it to you that relatively recently there's been a big surge in the voices of women in the public square here with nevertheless, she persisted, me too, the hats, all of those sorts of things. See, women are trying very hard to be able to get a voice in the public square and speak for themselves. The voice of Mary saying, from now on, all generations will call me blessed. The idea was that the role of women was supposed to roll on throughout history, and whatever we did with it, we did something wrong with it here. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the reason that I want to talk about this in the church is because the way I see it, the church ought to be leading the way. The church should be the city on the hill, the light that cannot be hidden. That's who we ought to be. Not necessarily that we're going to get it all right, but surely we should be the example. We shouldn't be the same as medicine and academia and engineering and all of those other things. We should be what they could possibly be. We should surely be that. And yet, I want to show you here a picture. Now, I know you can't read any of this. It's okay. It's really just a reminder to me. It's a graph. And across the bottom are the percentage of females engaged in a certain activity, and up the side is how much they are paid per dollar paid to a man for the same job. So if we were to assume that the planet is roughly 50-50 men and women, 50-50 would be right there, and that when a man is paid $1, a woman is paid $1, so 50% there, all of the way to the top, to the $1 mark, we would want to be right there. That would be not just equality, this would be equity. See, it's very easy to talk about equality until the money comes out on the table, and then it gets tough, right? So that's where we would want to be. If there was to be somewhere that would be perfect, we'd have a little spot up there, but we don't. What we do have is over here we have social workers and counsellors, so you see roughly 75% female, and they are paid about 92 cents on the dollar compared with a man. And when you look at all full-time workers, the average for all workers is right there, so just slightly less than 50% women, and they are paid about 82 cents on the dollar compared with men. So where's the church? The church is here. It is the outlier on the extreme edge of this graph that says that somewhere around 20% of clergy people are female, and they are paid about 76 cents on the dollar compared with men. It seems to me that the church is not actually being the city on the hill that cannot be hidden and the shining light to show the rest of the world what do we do when we're talking about equality and equity. In fact, we're worse than all of these other fields here in the church. So this is a big problem. Does it have an effect? Does it matter? Yes, it really, really matters. So in this report, about what's called the stained glass ceiling in churches, that says there's a stained glass ceiling and above it women cannot rise, says that women clergy have historically low retention rates. The dropout rate for women in the church is insanely high. And this article says, and I think not entirely accurately, that they're more likely to leave their congregations than men because of lack of support from the hierarchical system. And then it says, because of the lack of support from higher-ups, the hierarchical system, women clergy are more likely than men to leave their congregations to seek out work in other areas. And, of course, once you've become trained as a clergy person, you've kind of committed yourself to a very tiny box. There aren't very many jobs that says Master of Divinity degree required, right? There just aren't. So you've kind of put yourself in a position now where if you want to get a job, you're probably going to get a lower paying one than the one you just left because you weren't being treated with equity. So they get lower paying jobs. The thing that strikes me as a little unusual here is putting the blame entirely on the hierarchical system and lack of support from higher-ups. I think that's absolutely true, that there's a hierarchical system and that women are not supported by the higher-ups, but there are many churches in which women are not supported by the people who are sitting right where you're sitting. It's absolutely the case. I mentioned, I think, at least at one of the services last week, and I can't remember which one, sorry, talking to a friend of mine who's a woman who'd recently started serving in a church, and she was only a couple of weeks in, and at the end of the church service she went and stood by the door and shook hands with everybody the way that pastors often do. And somebody on the way out said to her, that was a really great sermon, and I just really loved it. You did such a good job. Thank you for filling in until the real pastor gets here. As we said to her. So, this person wasn't up there in the hierarchy or somebody. It was somebody right in the pews. I mean, what a demoralizing thing to say to another person. So this is a big problem, and this is an equity problem here to do with how women leaders in churches are treated. So, how do you think Deborah and Jael would respond to a situation like that? I think Jael would get out a tent peg and a hammer again, is what I think. So I don't think that Deborah and Jael would just lie down for something like that. I don't think so. That was at the end of the Bronze Age. I mean, come on. It's the end of the Bronze Age. We've had literally thousands of years to do better than this. And we are a long way away from it. And I think it's important for us to hear it because, as I mentioned again last week, we have women from our congregation going off into ministry in the church. And I hope that within our little church family that we'll do everything we can to support them. But when they walk through these doors, the sort of nonsense they're going to encounter looks like I've just been describing to you. People are going to want to pay them 75 cents on the dollar compared with what the man is getting and that sort of thing. This is just wrong, right? So, how can you help with redeeming this situation? I said last week, and I think it bears repeating, that for somebody like me, I'm of an age and a background where I was taught when there's a situation and there's something wrong in the situation, that my job, I was raised to jump in, take control, and fix it. That's what my parents taught me to do. They did. They taught me to do because that was the right thing to do. There's a bad situation, Julian, fix it. And it took me a really long time, because I'm barely teachable. It took me a really long time for women to teach me that maybe they can fix their own situation. Maybe me jumping in is simply me putting my hand over their mouth so I can be heard, so I can fix it. And that while sometimes it might be appropriate to jump in and help somebody, jumping in and taking over may be exactly the wrong thing to do because it just silences the woman who's involved. So I've kind of concluded that that really cool set of lines by Barak in this story is important. Remember, he says to Deborah, well, if you'll go with me, I'll go. But I'm not going to just jump in on my own. I'm not doing that. I'll go with you if you want me to. And I think maybe that's a better approach that I have to learn, is when the situation arises, to say to the woman who's involved, do you want me to help? Can I help? Can I go with you? Can I stand next to you? Do you want me to speak or do you want me to remain silent? I think these things are all important. And I'm learning. And I hope that those of you who are committed to equity and equality will learn with me, because it matters. It really does. And if we can't get it right as the church, how on earth is the medical profession going to get it right, or the engineers, or the academics, or the school teachers, and so on? Right? We're supposed to be the light at the top of the hill that everybody looks at and says, see, it is possible. So we have work to do. And it's important work, and it really matters. Okay, let's move on now to respond to this word. And we respond to the word through our offerings and in our celebration of the sacrament of Holy Communion. So I would ask you, when you come forward, to place your offering in the basket or pause for a moment of prayer over the offering basket, that our gifts and tithes and offerings will be devoted to the building of God's kingdom here on earth. And if you would turn to page 9 in your hymnals, page 9, and join me in the great thanksgiving. Join me in the great thanksgiving. In the great thanksgiving, just before we start, when we get specifically, especially towards the end, you will notice there's a whole passage that talks about, by your Spirit make us one with Christ, one with each other, one in ministry to all the world. That